Hey, Diversity Disruptors, you are in for a treat today. I have with me Nakia White of Nakia White Consulting, and also who has a weekly show that you don't want to miss of Intentional Conversations. And today, this conversation that we're going to be having is talking about impact versus activity. And as a diversity consultant, I know that you've been extremely busy. Your phone has been ringing off the hook. You've been getting all kinds of opportunities to come and make a change in organizations. But today we want to talk about really that change and how impactful are you being and how you can be even more activity. You know, it's almost kind of like how we talk about busy versus productivity. And so today we're going to be talking about impact versus activity. So welcome, Nakia, to our show. We're so happy to have you on HR for Her.
Thanks so much for having me. It's a joy to be here, so thank you.
Great. So we're just going to jump right in. So we're going to really be talking about impact versus activity. First of all, what does that even mean when we talk about having impact versus having activity?
Well, so I always like to talk about it by way of getting people to realize that when we are eager to see movement around any type of big initiative or endeavor, because we're just passionate and have a lot of energy for it, we just want to see movement. And sometimes what that translates into would be some type of activity. And usually activity, they have start and end dates, like a program, or maybe even an initiative that has a start and end date. And so when I talk about this work of diversity, equity, and inclusion, there's no end date to it. We are constantly finding new and different milestones to be able to operate at an exemplary level. So even once we've reached certain areas of focus, we then begin to imagine what's next. How do we now elevate this to the next level? And so I think that it's important for people to see the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion as a way to solve for it by impact, which means we have to think about systems, culture, procedures, policies. And that mindset requires a shift sometimes, but I think it prepares people to be much more thoughtful about the strategic approach, to align words with action that leads to outcomes that are sustainable. So that's really how I like to talk about activity versus impact.
So there was so we're going to kind of break that down. So we talk about, sustainability and not having an end date in a start date and an end date, that this is something that should be happening on a continuous basis and going on. But many times as a consultant, an external consultant who's been hired to come in, usually is a start and an end date. How do you get that client to see that it should be more than just getting started and saying, okay, come and do some trainings, do my senior leadership and our frontline managers, and we'll be good? How do you get them to see something different?
Yeah, so I love this question. And there's actually a few different strategies that I have found to be effective in creating the type of relationship that you want with your clients. And so for me, I spend a lot of time on the front end vetting my clients the way that they're vetting me. So I ask very thoughtful questions. I want to know, what was the catalyst that led you to pick up the phone and say, hey, we need your services? What is the why or the business case for you? And each organization is different. So what's going to drive their motivation for diversity, equity, and inclusion is really important, because then that tells me a lot about how committed they want to be. And so I think it's also about creating this level of partnership with clients to where you become an extension of their team. And that partnership allows for a greater level of accountability. I love the fact that as an extension of the team, I'm owning the outcomes as well, right? Which means that I'm going to want to have a safe space to be able to challenge the status quo, to cause us to think differently about maybe some of the ways in which legacy has had an impact. And we've always done it that way, so we're going to continue to keep doing it that way. So I think we have to be, as practitioners in this space, committed to having those tough conversations on the front end to make sure that we are guiding our clients in the right direction, to where they are thinking about it as a broader scope of work. That, this work is not a sprint, it's a marathon. And as I mentioned before, it's a journey. So we should always be constantly evolving and tracking and measuring. And then once we reach those goals, again, identify new goals. And so I think that's the difference. It's helping them to provide that shift in mindset.
And I love the fact that you said that we become a partner. So too many times, I think sometimes we're like, okay, we just want to get in and get out. Because you want to look to go to the next client. But if you're thinking about it in the fact that, do you want to make impact? And by doing that vetting in the beginning, finding out exactly, like, why did you call me anyway? Like, what were you trying to do? Was this a checkbox? Or was it that there was a fire and you just want to put out the fire, but you're not necessarily making sure that there's not going to be a new fire after I leave? It's and coming in a spirit of partnership, of saying, how can we work on this and get through that? I love that perspective. So when coming there and we're talking about, now we're partnering with this person to actually, I would say, probably build a value of diversity and a value of inclusion within their organization. How do we like steer the ship in saying, hey, this is activity, but this is where you're going to get impact? What can we do to help steer the ship in the right direction?
Well, I think it also goes back to what I said before, is that it begins with those initial upfront conversations. I like to, do an assessment of the organizational readiness, which includes leadership readiness. And I have a spectrum tool that I use for it. And there are 12 different dimensions of DEI work. And with each of those dimensions, we'll have conversations about, it's almost a counting the cost conversation before you get started. Do you realize that in order for you to be perceived as credible in operating at a high level in DEI, that this is what this looks like? Or are you willing to count the costs, So that way they at least have a vision of the North Star before getting started. And I think that helps them to align among themselves even, because sometimes we come to clients where there could be 2 or 3 different leaders and they are not in alignment around the priority of DEI. And so when you get all of those individuals in a room, I think that it just forces the conversation. And if nothing else, it brings to light the need to help to make the adjustments where appropriate. And sometimes I have left those conversations where I clearly knew this organization is not ready for this quite yet, And then, therein lies the big leadership opportunity to be able to say, if we don't address these areas and get this, into alignment, then you're going to have an adverse effect, because you're not going to be able to create something that's meaningful, that's impactful, and that can be sustained until we address X, Y, Z. And so sometimes that's even about aligning the values of the organization to this work of DEI. We can't assume that people understand the constructs of diversity, equity, and inclusion in the same way. They may understand it theoretically, but what about the practice of it? What does that look like for your organization? What are those values violators that helps people to connect with? If I don't operate within this capacity, then that's against the culture and the goals of the organization, and there are consequences to that. And so those are the types of conversations that I think occur that helps to level set, if you will, the foundation upon which I think organizations can begin the work and be successful.
And I love assessment, because sometimes organizations are not quite sure what they're getting themselves into, and they, and having that assessment not only gets them to kind of deeply think long term about what they're doing and what their expectations are, because even when they're asking practitioners to create programs or trainings or whatever the activity, sponsorships, they're just thinking, we need to do something.
Yes, exactly. We need movement. And I say all the time, movement is not necessarily impactful. It's, to your point, busy or productive, which one? Let's resolve that.
Everybody's moving, but where are we going?
Right.
So
and you mentioned, I was just going to share, you mentioned assessment. I think that part of this process too is convincing clients of the need to gather data to help inform the path forward plan. And so I do a lot of audits and assessments, and it's really just about inventorying current activity that could be in favor of diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's also about understanding the pulse of those within the organization, their lived experiences, how they perceive the culture, and leveraging both qualitative and quantitative data collection strategies. You really are able to create this solid narrative that then gives you this baseline to be able to identify, how do we now address the opportunity of diversity, equity, and inclusion to help align with the mission of the organization. And so sometimes that data in and of itself can be incredibly powerful to getting leaders to see, oh, I didn't think we had a problem, but apparently we do. Where we sit determines what we see. And sometimes those leaders, what they're seeing is from their vantage point. And it's not enough just to say we have a very inclusive environment if you're going off of your lens and your experience only. People in the organization need to be able to say that and feel that way.
I think that's so important. I was having a conversation today with my daughter just on that same thing, that depending on when you're sitting, sometimes, and most of the times, the decision makers are so far removed from the actual issue or from the problem. I mean, the layers down.
Yes.
We see it a lot in nonprofits. The person who sometimes is leading that has not necessarily experienced some of the pain that the everyday person is going through.
Yes.
Therefore, we're kind of like tackling the issue, like you said, from our vantage point. We're like, oh, I feel included. Everybody should feel included. I don't understand why they don't feel included. Okay, maybe we just need to have a barbecue and make
Right. Yes. Yes. And we have to get to a place to where we believe people's experiences. That's a big challenge too, I think, for a lot of organizations and organizational leaders in particular, because again, if that's not their experience, they tend to maybe dismiss it as, oh, well, that couldn't have possibly happened. Or maybe you were just being too sensitive, or you're over exaggerating. And so we have to believe people's experiences. So I love the idea of getting people to a place where they recognize the necessity of getting proximate to the problems, really at the groundwater level, right? Peeling back all those layers and identifying at the groundwater layer, what are the circumstances? So anyway, I agree with you, Sable.
Yeah. But so now we understand, like, we need to decide what the root of the problem is. So it's kind of like, I would say that if I don't know what the real problem is, then I don't know I'm solving it. So we don't know. So without that assessment, without looking at the groundwork, not just you saying, well, last week someone said this word and we know that this is wrong, so come and do diversity training. I've been called in on that kind of situation, oh my gosh, this person said this, we need diversity training.
Yes.
So without, like you said, we have to get to the root. Now, in doing that, we still need, you talked about the assessment, you talked about the leadership assessment. So we as practitioners need to also be confident as we're presenting to potential clients or to internal senior leaders that we have a real case for what we're talking about. So
Absolutely.
we need to do the work. So we need to do that before going in. You talked about your leadership assessment. What are you looking for, or what do you see that actually says this organization is ready?
That's a great question. And for me, it's more about the attitude and the mindset than it is about what body of work is already indicative of an organization being successful and committed to the success of it. Because I believe that people have different starting points, and even for those who are entering this DEI conversation late, whatever that may be, they're in the conversation now. So as practitioners, what are we going to do to help support them? And so what I do believe is that we can't guilt, shame, blame them, because they're late to the conversation. We need to really support them. So for me, it is more about in asking those upfront questions, am I getting a good discernment around their commitment to the process? And the process as it relates to how are we going to sustain this? And so I'm asking questions about infrastructure. If we built this comprehensive multi-year diversity, equity, and inclusion plan, it's going to be a beautifully packaged plan that's going to sit on the shelf unless we have the infrastructure with human capital and financial capital to execute it. So again, have you counted the cost? Have you thought about that? And if in those conversations, they are receptive to it, they're open to it, and they're really taking these suggestions of, again, the subject matter experts who have led this work for clients quite successfully, then to me, that is a commitment that I welcome. And so they can even be starting at ground zero. So to me, it's just more about the attitude of the leadership and the commitment to the process, because you're not going to see significant changes overnight. And so I need to also make sure that we're managing expectations and that they understand that too. It's slow and steady, but consistency that gets you to outcomes that I think organizations can be proud of if they adopt that mindset.
Yeah, there were two people, slow and steady, in which, I really wish people kind of like just absorb that, slow and steady. You're trying to change a culture, and it's not going to happen overnight. We were sitting in a meeting the other day, and they have a lot of cultural issues. And the question was like, we need to see something move. And I said, we need to manage expectations.
Yeah.
We need to manage expectations. We need to realize that in 3 years, it takes normally for a culture to change. We have to think about the fact that people become aware.
Right.
Then they have to now kind of say, do I accept what I heard? And that I do need to make a change. So that takes time. And then we have to now adapt new behaviors to make that change. So there's so many parts to that. So I love that you're reminding people to take it slow, to take it slow. And then having them look at the entire cost. So when someone sees that whole plan, then they get to say, that's not what I'm bought, like, no, we're not.
Yeah, and again, it's not so much of delivering a plan to them, because then it becomes the practitioner's plan, right? So the way in which I like to engage with clients is, again, this is a partnership. What I bring is a lens of expertise around diversity, equity, inclusion. I can share trends with you, best practices, help you to have a framework upon which to engage in this DEI work. But what you have is a knowledge base of the nuances of your internal structure, of what your culture is. And I mean, all of the other data that certainly, the financial situation, all of that plays a part in what ends up into the final plan. And that's important for me, because I never want my clients' plans to be a plan that I gave to them. It needs to be a plan that they also buy into.
Co-creating.
Yes, co-creating. And I find that resistance is often a lack of clarity. And so there are some low-hanging fruit opportunities that I think are equally important while you're trying to get everybody in alignment around the impact that you're trying to create. And that is through education, learning and development experiences. People are going to have a hard time engaging in strategy conversations around what to do, how to do it, implementation, tracking metrics, if they don't understand just at its core the constructs of diversity, equity, and inclusion, how it shows up, how it's practiced. And so we need to do some level setting too. So I always tell people that if you're hungry just for some type of movement immediately, you can never go wrong with solving for that by providing learning and development, training opportunities for people to build their knowledge base.
And then now support that with a long-term plan, right?
Yes.
So that's like the start and get it set. So right before we all started, Nika and I were talking about the Me Too movement as something versus impact versus activity. So we all saw with the Me Too movement, lots of organizations putting in sexual harassment practices. We saw now after the George Floyd murder, after that, we saw a lot of people hiring for diversity. So again, we see activity. But if we think about impact with the Me Too movement, which really got, we want to say, a lot of traction, a lot of attention, a lot of movement in corporations in 2017, this is 3 years later, and still 97% of sexual harassment cases are not reported. So we none of us who are doing this work want to be part of anything that has that kind of statistic.
Right.
So what should we be measuring along the way, so we're not 3 years in, or 3 years later saying 97% of women still, or men, experience sexual harassment and don't report it, that still, Black women are still experiencing microaggressions and being asked questions about their hair. What's happening with Asian community right now because of the coronavirus. So with all of the work that we're doing, what kind of milestones and measurements should we be looking at along the way, so we don't get to the end and then realize we were having activity and not impact?
Yeah. Well, so I'm a firm believer that specificity is incredibly important to these type conversations. And it's been interesting to me to witness through some of the clients I'm working with that there's a lack of clarity around what is the process for if someone has a complaint relevant to any type of harassment. what is the grievance process, and really just crystallizing that for the people in the organization so that they feel like if they ever encounter something of that nature, they have a clear path of steps to take to try to resolve it. And so I think that's one thing, is that's a simple metric, which is, do you have clear policies that are communicated and available, and to help address and deal with those situations. And then the other is, if you are finding that there are incidents, are you clear about effective corrective measures that need to be implemented in order to help minimize that? Because sometimes people don't know what they don't know. And I don't want to come across as naive in that, you know, some blatant acts, yes, absolutely. That's just a matter of people wanting to operate in an inappropriate manner. But sometimes there's gray area. We have to realize that some of the lines are blurred, right? And so that's why I say that being very specific is, I think, part of the solution, and not shying away from that. I think too many people are of the mindset that, okay, if it happens, then we'll kind of address it, but I don't think that's going to happen here. Our culture is so family oriented, or it's just, you know, it's such a, we all love each other, we're a big family. And the reality is that that's not the way to operate, you know, as an organization. I mean, you can certainly have a culture that breeds a high level of respect and friendly kindness to each other, but those policies are very important. So I think that's part of it, is we need to make sure that we are holding organizations accountable for having clarity and clear systems and procedures to be able to deal with this, for people to come forth. And the other thing is, and this one is harder to measure, but it's about having a culture of speaking up, and a culture of psychological safety. But when you do encounter something that, you know, could potentially be delicate, that you're not afraid to step forward. And that's equally important for women and professionals of color, because again, those marginalized communities, and I'll even put LGBTQ community in that. And it's because their stories are already not believed by people, you know, just because their experiences are seen to be, oh, that didn't happen here. They're just missed often. And so yeah.
That's not oh, you must have misunderstood them. Or,
yes. Oh, they didn't mean it. They were joking with you. Or yes, no. It doesn't take away how it made me feel, and how now I feel unsafe here. And so that becomes your problem as an organization, and you have to fix it. Otherwise, be prepared for lawsuits, or even people just leaving the organization, and then there's reputational risk, because, you know, they may not be willing to talk very fondly or positively of the organization. So we have to think about all of these implications when we aren't being proactive and intentional to address the potential of some of these challenges, creating negative experiences for people within the organization.
So you touched on retention. And so how much does retention play into all of this for organizations as they are looking to solve these issues and these challenges that are having in their organization? How much is there some measure around retention we can see that's happening where, like, well, we did all these activities, but it didn't have any impact because look at our retention. So is there any correlation in retention?
Well, I think it goes back to whatever your strategies are, just make sure that they are effective. And so it takes having, you know, intervention strategies every so often. So evaluating where you are, maybe every quarter, and not waiting until the end to say, well, this didn't work, so now we're not going to try it again. Yes. You know, we always need to be revising and modifying. And don't be afraid to try different things within reason. You know, I think that sometimes we live in a society to where we feel like unless we know for certain that it is going to work out exactly how we want it to, we're not going to go there. And we need to be just as innovative and creative with our approach to problem solving around diversity, equity, and inclusion issues as we are around new products, new services, and all of the other disciplines and departments that become really important to organizations seeking success. And so we have to approach DEI in that same fashion. Don't be afraid to try certain things and then modify if you see that it's not working. There's not a one-size-fits-all approach. I do know that. And I think that organizations sometimes are seeking an easy button, but we have to just be willing to do the hard work and commit to the hard work.
I like that we need to be able to be as fluid, innovative, creative, and ready for change in our DEI policies as we are with our products and services. And think about it from that perspective, because what we think about is we write the policies. You've talked a lot about, having the policies and the procedures
Right.
and the practices, and we think we write them, we put them in a book, and we lock it up, or hopefully we do more than lock it up. Well, we're operating in those, and we don't think that they ever have to change. But if you even just take an example of like Coca-Cola, right? I mean, we had New Coke, and then we had Diet Coke, and then we had Coke, and then we have Cherry Coke, Vanilla Coke. We
have Coke Zero.
Coke Zero, right? Right? So we have all of that. Why? Because it's the same product, but we realize there needs to be changes. So I just love that, because we cannot just do our DEI practice, policies, procedures, programs, whatever we're doing, walk away and think that's going to carry us through.
And that's not a one-size-fits-all approach. So you think about the fact that we exist as a society where there's all different types of people that have vastly different needs. I even think about the multi-generational workforce that we have right now. Let alone all of the other dimensions of diversity that can show up within a workplace. There's so many. And so I think that organizations are beginning to be more thoughtful about, we can't solve for success from a performance perspective, productivity perspective, by treating everyone the exact same. And that's where the conversation of equality versus equity also takes root. If equality is the end goal, then equity is the means, because not everybody starts at the same place. Not everybody's experience is at a place to where they're able just to walk in day one and just grow and thrive. What resources and support are being made available to them that fits their very specific situation and needs?
That's another area, as you are creating this plan and you're talking about sustainability, that you cannot leave out, right? Equity.
Right.
And I love the way you describe that. Equity is the means for it to get to equality, because we're not at equality now. And if we want to get there, then we do need to have some way to get there. And when you're talking about sustainability, all those pieces have to be there.
Yeah.
It's not one or the other. It's not, let's create a diverse organization without thinking about the equity that we need to provide so people can come in, so we can have a diverse organization. So when they get in, they can actually feel included, so we can keep them because they now belong to us. And we
absolutely. Yes. No one can show up at their best in any environment if they're always questioning whether or not they belong. If they're having to question, do I belong here? Am I valued? Do my contributions matter? Do I have full opportunity for success? Then they're not bringing their A game, which means that collectively as an organization, the organization is not reaching its full potential from a performance standpoint. And so that in and of itself should certainly give pause to those leaders who are discounting the need for greater intentionality around inclusion and equity.
Well, we can talk for like from here to tomorrow, but
absolutely.
Well, before we start to close, I just have a few questions that I want that we ask all our guests. But the first I want to ask, is there anything that you just want to share that you just feel like at this pulse of everything that's just happening around us, we're in a time that we have never experienced before on so many different areas. I mean, people are just getting hit left, right, and center, almost to the point we can almost not even, breathe, because we're just overwhelmed. So, with work, what's going on in organizations, just anything that you would like to just share that you feel that, just would be helpful. Anything I should have asked you that you felt like, I want to tell you this.
I appreciate this question, so thank you. There's actually two things that comes up for me that I think would be important for this community to hear. The first is this premise of being inclusion-minded and operating with the lens of equity being a leadership competency. And I'm not saying leadership by way of position or title, but leadership by influence. And if we think about it in that regard, people can lead and influence from any place within the organization, right? The reason that becomes so important to this broad conversation is that I find that there are a lot of people who, at their core, they can value the fact that some level of attention is being given to diversity, equity, and inclusion, but they're passive about it, and that they see it as the responsibility of others, of people who carry the title of Chief Diversity Officer, Manager, Director, or Practitioner, or even the HR, professional. But I think that if we begin to see it as a leadership competency, then we can own that and we can put it into our journey. And I think it makes us more accountable to it, whereby we are feeling called to action in different regards relevant to, again, diversity, equity, and inclusion. So that's one thing. The other thing too is that we have to find ways to instill hope. There's so much that's happening right now that we can feel defeated before even trying. And I think that that's going to certainly be to our detriment. And so even as painful and triggering as so many circumstances may be for us, we need to find ways to be able to remain hopeful. And because if we are hopeful, then we're going to continue to find ways to be called to action, to doing our part to help us all emerge stronger. And so those are the two things that I really would like to share. So thank you for giving me that opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you. So critical. And that ties right back what you're saying about having impact versus activity. Having it as a competence, that means that it's going to make impact because we're working towards being measured for it. We're being assessed on it. And so therefore, it's not just something that we're doing busy work. So the other question we'd like to ask is, what would be your hashtag for gender diversity?
My hashtag for gender diversity. Okay, so assumingly I can't use Me Too because it's not unique and it's not mine.
You're right.
That's such a great question.
Oh, I didn't want to stump you.
You did. I think I have a lot of passion around women lifting as we climb. Yeah. And so it's kind of a long hashtag, but maybe it's women lift as they climb or something along those lines, because I believe that there's this notion that the pathway to success is so narrow. Only a few of us can get to those places of. And I don't believe that's the case. And so we need to be very thoughtful about how are we supporting our sisters? How are we protecting the full turf? When one of us wins, all of us win. So maybe that's it too. Protect the turf. Maybe that's it. Protect the full turf. Yes. There you go.
I love that. All right. And so before you go, we're going to hand you the HR magic wand, and you can any policy, what would you just, do you have the HR magic wand to change? What are you going to change?
Oh, the HR magic wand. I'm not sure if there's a motion, but this is what I see the motion would be. Gosh, I think that it should be absolutely mandatory for organizations to have some policies around solving for diversity, equity, and inclusion. And it's not just an HR function, it is an organizational function across the board. And so I think that HR can certainly help lead that and influence it. But the wand needs to be, don't just rely solely on me, but everybody now is owning this.
Yeah.
Is owning this. That's what I would do with the magic wand.
Right, because you're going to see, that's right.
Right.
Thank you so much. How can they reach out to you, follow up with you? Yes.
No, it's great. Well, I'm on all social media platforms, but the best way to be able to connect with me and to connect with each of those social media platforms is through my website, which is simply nikawhite.com. So it's nikawhite.com. And lots of great complimentary resources are out there as well. Blog articles, white papers, short videos called Inclusion Uncomplicated, Simplifying DEI. And so I encourage people to go out there and check out some of those complimentary resources, especially for those who are interested in the self-education around leading more inclusively. So thank you.
Thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you.
It's been an honor. Thank you so much. I appreciate you thinking of me and allowing me to share with your audience. Thank you.